So the Essenes had at Qumran a meal, a ritualistic messianic uh, meal that looked really similar to the Eucharist or the Last Supper.
Right.
What do you think inspired this meal?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that ultimately it's Scripture that is inspiring what they're doing. I think
Hmm.
their water washing rituals were inspired by the various prophetic texts that spoke of some kind of coincidence of water washing with the gift of the Spirit, and you find these frequently. Ezekiel 36, the sprinkling of clean water that will bestow a new heart and a new spirit on Israel. Um, Isaiah 44 that speaks of pouring clean water on a dry ground, which is then interpreted as the outpouring of the Spirit on the people of Israel. So that's the water rituals that they're performing. Then you got the meal rituals, and I think that inspiring their meal rituals are texts like Isaiah 23 that promises this banquet on Mount Zion that's going to swallow up death. I think passages like Isaiah 55 1 through 3 that talks about a free meal that will initiate the participants into the covenant that was enjoyed by David. Um, those texts and others um, are inspiring their practice. And so what you see them doing is having this sacred ritual at noon every day where they're consuming bread and wine under the leadership of a priest who prays and blesses the elements of the meal before anybody partakes. And then we find in the appendix to the community rule, which we call it the rule of the congregation, but it gives adjustments to their ritual practice to adjust for the coming of the Messiah. We see that they expected to share this ritual meal of bread and wine with the Messiah when he arrived, and really they expected two Messiahs, um, again, who are going to share this meal with them. And so it seemed like this daily meal was an anticipation of this end times banquet that was going to be enjoyed with the messiahs, because they typically expected two, a
Hmm.
priestly and a royal Messiah. When the end of time was ushered in, the Messianic age, and when everything was restored and the kingdom of Israel was restored, and all of that. So you can see there a lot of similarities with the Last Supper and the early Christian Eucharist.
So the Last Supper, is this a Passover meal or is this a ritualistic meal like they had at Qumran? Or is Jesus bringing both things together?
Yeah, yeah, the latter. I think he's bringing both things together, because
Mm,
definitely a Passover, and yet the Passover didn't have uh, a unique blessing over the bread and the cup like we see in the Gospels. That seems to be a kind of unique innovation that Jesus introduces into the Passover Seder. But when he does, I mean, you can't help, if you've studied the passages of Josephus where he describes their ritual practice, if you looked in the scrolls where they describe their own ritual meal, you can't help but be struck by the similarity.
mhm.
Um, for example, in the scrolls, it's emphatic that the priest has to reach out his hand first, and he's got to bless the bread and the wine before anybody else partakes. And we see Jesus doing that at the Last Supper. He's acting like the priest in the Essene ritual practice by blessing the elements before anybody partakes and then distributing the elements to the others. There's a strong emphasis on everybody sitting and partaking by rank in the Dead Sea Scrolls when they're at this ritual meal. And you see in Luke, for example, that a fight breaks out among the disciples about their respective ranks in the context of the Last Supper.
Mm.
So they and why would that be? It's because they're trying to sit in order there, but they didn't know exactly what that was. And so I think you have a fusion there. You've got, yes, it is a Passover, no doubt about that. But Jesus is introducing some innovations within the Passover liturgy, and those innovations reflect Jewish ritual practice, which is reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there's also indication that very devout Pharisees also gathered into little communities where they had something similar, this ritual meal of bread and wine that they celebrated. So it looks like this practice was more widespread than simply the Essenes. And when we're knowledgeable about that, and then take that information to the gospel texts that describe the Last Supper, we see Jesus acting in this priestly liturgical fashion. And for the apostles that had been formed in Essenism before they became disciples of Jesus, they would have perceived, they would have looked at what Jesus was doing and saying, this is what we expected the priestly Messiah to do,
Right.
at the end of time. And it's just very, very
Right.
powerful.
Absolutely. And I think it was Peter and his brother that were followers of John the Baptist before Jesus,
Well,
according to the Gospel of John.
John chapter 1 indicates that Andrew was a follower of John the Baptist before he becomes a disciple of Jesus. And Andrew is hanging around with a conspicuously unmentioned second disciple in John chapter 1. And there's a long tradition of understanding that this second disciple, who is curiously left unnamed, was actually John. So John and Andrew seem to, at least those two, seem to have been followers of John the Baptist, disciples of John the Baptist, before they become, disciples of Jesus. And I think that possibly others. There may have been one or two, as many as four of the apostles may have had a background in Essenism prior to following Jesus.